Hello, I am the lonely water chestnut in your entire stir-fry, Kent.
And hello, I'm that sentient twitch in your eye now petitioning for Federation membership, Tony.
Ooh, I love it. Well, welcome to the Imaginaries podcast. We have a very, very special episode in store for you today, and we actually have a very special guest. So, Tony, do you want to go ahead and walk us through who our guest is and how we got connected to him?
Yes, I'm not going to talk for but a second, because I just want to say a big welcome to Suyi, who actually we started talking to last summer, I think.
It's been a while.
It's been a while, yeah. So this has been a long time coming, but we're really excited to have him as our guest on the podcast. So I'm actually just going to turn it over to him and have him tell you guys a little bit about who he is.
Suyi, who are you?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ken. Who am I? That's, it's weird that as a writer, that's the hardest question to answer. Yeah, it's the most difficult, but I'm so many things. But I'd say maybe I talk about my relationship with my work, I guess, which is what most readers, I guess, might be interested in. So my name is Suyi Okungbowa. I know my name is always a difficult thing to get right, but yeah, it means it's a name from. I come from a very small city that's really ancient, dates back to the 1100s. So it used to be the Benin Kingdom or Benin Empire, but now it's called Benin City. And my name means the sea has come home.
Oh, cool!
Wow.
So, yeah, I know.
Wow, that's awesome.
Actually, I get started. Why I got started in science fiction and fantasy. I mean, yeah, that's the number one reason it's in my name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Wow.
Well, that's amazing. And
yeah.
Suyi, you have a book coming out later this year, David Mogo, Godhunter. So just at the top of the show, we wanted to make sure that our listeners knew this, and we're looking forward to this book. It is well worth placing a pre-order, checking it out online, purchasing it wherever you can, because this is a work that is in conversation with so much going on in science fiction and fantasy. So later on in the podcast, we're hopefully going to talk a little bit about some of those intersections. But first off, Tony, I believe you get to call the shots today. So what is our first question for Suyi?
My first question is actually for you. You just said intersections, like saxophone intersections.
Yes.
I don't know. It was just funny. It was hilarious. So I'm actually going to back us up just slightly and say, for the first time yet, because I totally dropped the ball on doing this, that today's episode is all about the socioeconomics of the post-apocalypse. And I mention this not only because it is our episode title, but because it is also the title of a talk in a paper that Suyi just gave in San Diego. So this is something that he's coming off very, very recently. And so I saw it and I was like, oh, I love that. So this is the episode. We're definitely going to use what Suyi has already presented, but put a little imaginary spin on what the socioeconomics of the post-apocalypse might be. So, Suyi, where did this idea come from originally? Why and how did you come to the socioeconomics of the post-apocalypse?
Yeah, so I think mostly it was in response to reading a lot of novels about the post-apocalypse and always just asking questions and wondering what these markers of the post-apocalypse were.
Mm-hmm.
I always ask why is this scenario that has been painted a post-apocalypse? because for a lot of like the work that came my way, mostly from a Western viewpoint, for someone who like, I grew up in Nigeria, I've lived like over 2 decades in Nigeria, and my experience was like completely different. And so I always questioned that. And I think what really sparked that topic for me for the paper was I read Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel in, I think, 2 years back or so. And one of the things that struck me was there was this character that responded very, had a very strong response to the loss of power in that, in the post-apocalypse, in the apocalypse that happened in that novel. And the response was so strong, like the character had this really visceral response to the loss of power and like darkness. And I was like, it's just completely weird, because I grew up like always having power cuts my whole life. Like every single day there were power cuts, and I was like, well, this description feels kind of like weird, because like, people lose power all the time, right?
Yeah.
So it got me thinking. And then I realized that a lot of the representation of the post-apocalypse that we've been getting, a lot of dominance, like media, film, and literature, is more from a, certain perspective, the perspective of more dominant, more privileged groups. And so the way the post-apocalypse is painted tends to be based on those like desires, or like those, what the normal or what normativity is, right, for those groups, compared to like other groups which don't have that. So it got me thinking, and then this conference came up, and they wanted a paper, and like I think the name conference had to do with like return, like reclaiming, basically everything that happens after an apocalypse, how you can like return to the what used to be. And so it just thinking like, if I came from a group that didn't have all of these things, all of these markers of like Western civilization that have suddenly been lost after an apocalypse, how would what kind of return would I want? Where would I return to? So that was basically the question that sparked that paper, and then I went into it and wrote it.
Oh my God, I'm just gonna say that first of all, and I honestly kind of just want to like hear you talk about this for like 40 minutes.
So, Suyi, this whole conversation about return and what an apocalypse even looks like for different people from different places and different times and different experiences, it kind of makes me wonder, is there something specific to science fiction or fantasy or science fantasy that makes the genre itself a good place or space for exploring the question of what the socioeconomics of the apocalypse are?
I guess to start with, apocalypses are speculative events, because luckily none of them has happened so far. So I mean that already is the first. That already like provides this ground for these speculative genres of science fiction and fantasy to sort of thrive and like come up with various iterations of or projections of what our world could be. But another thing is because with science fiction and fantasy we can like break these rigid boundaries of our current world. We can bring in more people with more experiences. We can put together more like diverse experiences within certain groups, and I think that really provides very fertile ground for us to sort of decide how each group is going to respond in this diversity. In my paper, one of the things I spoke about was migration, for instance. One of the major things that happens during apocalypses is people migrate, right? But like if you're thinking about this from the perspective of a group that has never migrated ever in their lives, it becomes this really big deal for them to move on foot from one place to another, versus say a group like that has always been migrating, e.g. the current migrants that at the U.S. Mexico Mexico borders.
Yeah.
And so their interpretation of like migration will not be the same as those who haven't. And so with science fiction and fantasy, we can create even more scenarios like that. We can stretch that and even make them, bring this into like starker relief. So we can like expose how these socioeconomics are kind of like different for each group or like various people. And it makes it easier for us to ask the question, whose world is being altered and by how much.
And I think that kind of provides an interesting return to something you said earlier about you actually are connecting several different points that we've talked about already, in that you're talking about real lived experiences and speculative space. And I do wonder, it does seem like the apocalypse, by certain privileged Western standards at least, has already happened. We talked about how none of the apocalypses have happened yet, but maybe they have, or they're ongoing, or they're just kind of chronic in certain spaces and cultures and times and places. And so your book specifically, I'm going to kind of dive into your book a little bit here. It pulls very specifically from a place and a time where, by certain standards, the apocalypse has always been happening, but with the return or the fall of the gods into our world, suddenly there's an added complication. But there's something going on there with like ongoing apocalypse intersecting with this new element, and I find that really interesting. And I'd love to hear you maybe talk a little bit about how Western privileged experience is being engaged with there, and maybe even interrogated in a really interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. It's funny because when I first wrote the book and took it out to be workshopped at this conference that I went to, a lot of the responses I got were focused. People kept telling me that this has a post-apocalyptic vibe to it, and I was like, I never thought of that. Basically, what I was describing as regular Lagos living that hadn't been affected too much by the speculative elements were the elements that sounded post-apocalyptic to these readers. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I actually went back and pushed that a bit further. And yes, so basically, I basically tried, because people have, readers so far have said, oh, this looks like something about a godpocalypse. And I'm like, well, maybe, but not so much. Mm-hmm. A lot of like what is happening isn't really apocalyptic. It's literally how a lot of people just leave. Mm-hmm. And even if there's this speculative element that has come in, and then there are these gods that are making everything even more difficult, a lot of people just keep on living and don't even really consider their situation apocalyptic, especially in the story. So that's one of the things I was trying to interrogate there, that everyone's interpretation of apocalypse is different. And for some people, especially groups who have been used to adversity, groups that have always existed in the lower axis of power and access, on that scale, they are less quick to interpret these things as cataclysmic or world altering, because for a long time their worlds have all altered by things outside of their control. Just more used to controlling things. So yeah, in my book, that kind of happens slightly, because while there's this infestation of deities and otherworldly beings, and then humans have to deal with living side by side with those, they still don't consider it quite apocalyptic in, say, the way you think about, say, The Walking Dead and having zombies all up. Yeah, they just see it as, well, our lives have always been, shitty anyway, and this is just even more shitty.
Yeah. Right.
There's a real sense of humor to it, too. One of the things I appreciated about David Mogo, Godhunter, is that there's such a rich sense of humor in dealing with the unexpected and with the added complication to an already complicated life. So I just wanted to commend you on that and just say like, it's unusual to find anything which is marketed at least with the word apocalypse or post-apocalypse in it. It's rare to find something marketed that way that has humor, that isn't poorly managed or kind of grimdark. We talked about grimdark in a previous episode, and you just have like really like good-natured people going about their lives and being good-natured about it, and that's just so phenomenally, I guess, revolutionary to the post-apocalyptic genre, I think, at least as far as Western audiences go.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like, if you've ever met Lagosians, like people who live in Lagos, that's pretty much how Lagosians just live. Like, the worst things could happen, and they just like go on with their lives, and I wanted that to be like reflected. So like, oh, we have all of these gods running about. Well, I'm just gonna go to work anyway, Yeah, that's pretty much the disposition. A lot of Nigerians in general have that disposition to like adversity in any sense. I mean, sure, like now there's social media, so that there's this room for everyone to just like, sound off. But yeah, for the most part, people just get on with their lives, and everything else that has been happening before just keeps happening, even if like this new adversity. So yeah, I wanted that to be reflected, especially because I also come from a country where that's not completely dismissive of the supernatural. So there's this slight acceptance. They're like, well, I mean, sure, gods, right? Okay, fine.
Yeah.
There's always been this room. There's always room for welcoming something that's otherworldly, and when it does happen, the people are like, okay, well, this isn't fun, but I guess we're just gonna. Well, we did have space in our minds for them, and well, now it's being proven that they exist. So okay, we move on, kind of like that. So I wanted that to be represented, and I'm glad that came off as humorous.
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way.
Yeah, and it's now that you're describing kind of like the tone and the affect, I will say right now that I have not read David Mogo, but I will because Ken has access to the thing.
The Neck Galley.
So they had access to an advanced copy of the book. But I will also say that, I cannot wait to read it, and just like the way that you guys are talking about it, I'm comparing that in my head with a lot of like the very kind of pseudo-literary apocalyptic books, especially post-apocalyptic books that have been coming out that we've been kind of, the point of view kind of tends to be, here's like the US after an apocalypse, and the people who are narrating it are like the people who are writing it, who are very much like, we want to live in New York City, and our like base of experience is New York City and things like that. And like they also tend to be very grimdark and very like tonally very even, like, kind of like not a whole lot of, I don't know, anything going on. Like, it's just kind of like energy. Dark and awful the whole time. Yeah. So I just, as I'm looking at some of the books and movies and whatnot that we put on the list, there are definitely a bunch that have, darker tones, even if they're not quite grimdark. But like Suyi, you had mentioned, like, for example, Mad Max, especially Mad Max Fury Road, which is definitely like it has a bunch of different tones. Its affects are many and varied. So I'm interested to hear you talk about maybe a little bit both Mad Max, because I wanted to go there, but also like what other books or series or any kind of science fiction and fantasy does a good job with this. Like, what were you drawing on?
So to be honest, to start with, I thought about David Mogo as less, because I didn't really think about it as post-apocalyptic. I thought about it more as closer to something like American Gods. I literally pitched it as American Gods in Lagos.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay.
Because what Neil Gaiman does there is it starts off this regular person's life that just, gets more complicated as, they interact with more and more, otherworldliness, etc. So that's kind of what really happens, even if in this case we start off with, the main character all being a demigod still. I wanted to keep it rooted in the present, especially for the, because Lagosians are going to read this and people of Lagos are very, very, careful about how their city is represented. I'm still a visitor. I've lived in Lagos only 5 years. So, they'd be like, yeah, you haven't lived here long enough to tell you, right? So I wanted to keep the presence of it and not, sort of project too far forward. And also not project too far into the future where everything's gloomy. I did comment on a lot of the post-apocalyptic literature coming out of America post 9/11 being very dark and gloomy for the very reasons that they were sort of mirroring the hopelessness that was kind of felt about that time, and then most books just follow that trend sort of. But yes, that I started out there. I pretty much pitched the novel as American Gods meets the Dresden Files. Because that kind of puts wizards and gods in the same space.
Yeah.
And then but I did think about a few other things. Not Mad Max though. But I did think a lot about stuff like The Walking Dead, even if it wasn't a zombie apocalypse. But I was thinking about stuff like how communities get formed, what the basic needs of the people are, and how they try to deal with that. But I will say that in truth, I tried not to look too much at existing literature, especially because I didn't want to fall into the same, sort of pigeonholes that I see in the literature. And I was more interested in focusing on the representation of the city of Lagos. So I actually looked more at a crime. There's a crime novel written by Leye Adenle. It's called Easy Motion to Earth. It's a crime novel set in Lagos, and it's one of the few crime noir books that really captures the essence of the city. And I read that while I was writing David Mogo, just to draw on that, focus on the, to capture the essence of the city. So in essence, what I'm saying basically is that I put a lot of effort, more effort on representing the realness of it rather than the otherworldliness of it. Sort of. In that sense. Yeah.
So is it, in a sense, then, Afro-presentism instead of Afrofuturism for you?
Sure, why not? Because it's not really even sure, it's kind of futuristic, but it's not really futuristic. You are right. I just think about it as contemporary fantasy. Really, that's how I think. People take urban fantasy because it's set in a city. It's godpunk because it has the gods and godpocalypse in it. But for me, I always went into it thinking about it as contemporary fantasy of just living every day and things just getting into our actual realistic world.
So how about if we were to think back kind of more largely about the post-apocalypse in all its many and varied forms, and the socioeconomics of the post-apocalypses? What would you I'm thinking of Mad Max more over in that space. And so what kind of, what are some good examples that really help you think about, and have helped you think about, what the socioeconomics of the post-apocalypse might actually look like?
So a good example, or two good examples, I think I can think of that I've read recently are, I know N.K. Jemisin's fifth season. The fifth season is
yes,
right, but you can see because it's not really portrayed that way, because the response of the people is not the usual response that we have,
right,
in a post-apocalypse, right? There's this instead the group has like redesign their living around constant apocalypses, which is not something that's usual in our post-apocalyptic literature, right? Our literature just talks about, there's this massive event, cataclysmic, and then everyone just sort of like has to like devolve into some other form of self. But like in that story, the people actually sort of change and start like design their new living, their new communities, their new selves to work with the earth that keeps having these apocalypses. So I thought about that, right? I mean, so that's a different way of thinking about it. And I think another one is Trail of Lightning.
Yes.
There is something that happens in the novel, but there's not really a lot of focus on, so everyone's just like gloomy and that, and everyone's like dark now. It's more of like everyone's kind of like moved past it and sort of like redesigned a way or like responded. So I'm like, so basically those two books got me to think about what we even define as apocalyptic in that sense. Like if you respond in that way, does it really make it apocalyptic? Because if we're saying that, then the World War II was apocalyptic
right.
in that right in that because we kind of like responded to that and had like bounced back. So is it maybe we are in a post-apocalypse? Thinking about it.
Yeah, totally. Because it's like you can, with something like World War II, like there's very clearly kind of like there's a beginning and there's an ending. And it's like, the way that a lot of apocalyptic books and shows and movies and whatnot think about it is very much like it is the apocalypse, like capital T, capital A. It is a thing. It is one and done. And it's like you can sort of sort things into before the apocalypse, and after the apocalypse. And so I really like the idea because I think that, reading the 5th season and the whole Broken Earth trilogy is like really, that's so true. And what part of what I love about those books is you actually, like, you're kind of inside the apocalypse the whole time because it isn't one thing. It's ongoing. It's like across scales. Yeah, totally. So that's really cool to think about it that way.
I also think that the Broken Earth series makes for a really interesting starting point for talking about, what happens socially and communally and collectively after an apocalypse or a disaster or in the midst of one, ongoing or otherwise. Because often post-apocalypse narratives, I would actually call this a trap. They fall into the trap of that gloominess that you're talking about, where everything falls apart, Walking Dead style. Society just disintegrates. And then new communities form, maybe, but they're struggling against like this overwhelming background noise of, societal collapse. And in Broken Earth, it's very collaborative. People have figured out a way to work with this. And it reminds me of reading some nonfiction texts like Franz de Waal's Animal Minds, where his thesis essentially is that communities that work together survive longer. So it's not survival of the fittest individual, it's survival of the fittest communities. And like, it's not pitting one person against another for survival, which is often what happens in post-apocalypse narratives. And it's something that you see too in, David Mogo. You have communities coming together and then maybe they get attacked, but then they come back together again, and then maybe they get attacked, but they come back together. It's this process of coming together that I find most interesting, both about David Mogo and the Broken Earth series. And I was wondering, especially because we've talked about Station 11, and, we could talk also about some other texts that we've thrown in the show notes, like Carrie Vaughan's Bannerless, where you have togetherness and community building as perhaps the main novum or new thing or central idea of the story. And I was wondering how this interacts with economics, since we're talking about socioeconomics of the apocalypse and that exchange.
That's pretty interesting. So the question really is like, so this single story, right? This single narrative of a post-apocalypse where everyone devolves into this, every man for himself. It begs the question, maybe that's just our projection of what we think today is, and we just might continue that way, or just maybe intensify, right? Our desire to be, this capitalist, greedy kind of like society, always looking out for, ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's our projection. That's the projection. That's why we get these narratives. But that then points out that maybe for communities that are used to being more, focused on togetherness and like growing together, their response is not going to be that. Their response is going to be more, how can we get together and build something new from this? And that's what really happens in like the 5th season, right? Mm-hmm. It's like people are used to working together to build something, even in the event of an apocalypse, right? Mm-hmm. And this is especially pertinent when you think about the economics of it. I used this theory by Clayton Alderfer. He was an American psychologist. So he built this socioeconomic theory, or like this needs theory out of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He called it the ERG theory. You have existence needs, you have relatedness needs, and you have growth needs. So existence needs are like basic stuff like food, shelter, water, clothing. Relatedness is like communication, connectedness. Transport is kind of a relatedness needs and transport and mobility, because that leads to like connection, right? And then growth is like to grow, the self, or to grow the community, So we're talking power, fuel, agriculture, architecture, etc., art as well. Mm-hmm. And so like one of the things that, came up during the talk was how much like for groups that are used to like getting existence needs like food, shelter, water, like without question, and also like amass these things for themselves in the event where that social contract that kind of allows them to do all of that, right? There's no Wall Street, there are no investments, so all of a sudden your money doesn't really mean anything. The response is kind of just going to intensify. It's them going to be, okay, so they're still going to be thinking the same way. How can I get all the food possible? How can I get all the water possible so I can like be this person that has everything? Mm-hmm. And then maybe right? But that's going to be different, say, for a community who's used to sharing the stuff that leads, that gives them more, that's used to sharing more of what they can use to satisfy their existence needs. Mm-hmm. So like communities are used to like giving food and water out to everyone to make sure everyone has equal, insurance, etc. Right. So these responses are going to differ, and they're going to differ depending on what we were pre-apocalypse, which I think a lot of post-apocalyptic narratives don't really think that thoroughly about. There's just this thought that everyone is going to react this way, right? Mm-hmm. But not really. It's mostly highly dependent on who we were before these events happened. That's mostly, we're going to be more of a semblance of that after. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in terms of the economics of it, those who are like power grabbing, used to be more dominant, will try to sort of like create a new equilibrium that sort of mirrors what they used to be, mm-hmm. in that sense.
So one of the things that we have also talked about but never like devoted an entire episode to is kind of what you were getting at there, which is when you have science fiction and fantasy that's kind of in the context of capitalist society, like you get a lot of science fiction and fantasy that takes like capitalist futures for granted. Like that's just kind of the direction that it goes in. What would you say when you're thinking about, again, works that you've maybe come to that show some alternatives, like where science fiction and fantasy that say, hey, capitalism isn't the only thing that we can do. There are also other economic and socioeconomic systems that like futures or fantasies might have. Like, where are they? What kind of examples do we have?
That's a good question. I haven't thought a lot about that, mostly because economics aren't really like my strong suit in terms of the what I explore when I'm writing.
Totally.
But I know that I'm going to say I will know it when I see it.
Yeah.
I will know it when I see it. I just haven't read out that far out yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to be looking out for literature that does that. But that's a good, thing to point out.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking of, because this is like I said, an ongoing kind of question. Like, how do you break out of this? Like, how do you sort of say in whether you're looking at completely fictional universes or you're looking at potential futures, like, how do you go beyond sort of, the societal milieu that is capitalism? And so Shauna McGuire, actually, her most recent novella in the Wayward Children series kind of takes on directly and this, again, it isn't necessarily breaking out of capitalism, but it's presenting this kind of idea of exchanges and a barter system and like good faith exchange, I think, is maybe the best way to think about what she's doing there. Like it's a full exploration of what this economic system would then look like. The goblin market is what it is called in
Christina Rossetti's poem. I am dying a little bit over the fact that the goblin market is an alternative to capitalism in this conversation, but I love it. The novella we're talking about is In an Absent Dream, and it just came out this year.
Yes. And I'm also thinking, not necessarily as good examples, but I put down in our show notes, there are definitely like those big banner works like Star Trek, like Culture, that kind of, they have this idea that humans and other people who humans encounter have moved past, like, we're in a post-scarcity future. People don't really need to compete for things. And so the idea is that we don't engage in hoarding behavior anymore because there's no point in doing that, which is like an awesome idea. But then in those franchises, you tend to have like groups, organizations, people who still do that, like whether it's individual, whether it is social or cultural. And so it's kind of like, the Harangi. So it's like, it's frustrating to sort of see this idea, but then be like, oh no, but actually on the back side of this footnote, this still exists. Like, it's still there. We still definitely very much think this is a part of the future. So this is a long way of saying that I actually don't really have any good examples, but I was frustrated when I couldn't come up with any.
Cory Doctorow is pretty much the only one I've heard of who really full-on interrogates something and has kind of broached the mainstream. His Walkaway is all about... it is about the transition from capitalism to anarchy, but it's still kind of feeling its way in the dark. So I'm interested to hear what you were going to say, Suyi.
Well, I was going to say, again, a lot of this is dependent on where, especially the author, right? Whoever is like thinking about these things, where they're approaching this from and where they're coming from.
Yeah.
My country, for instance, where I grew up and like have lived for like a really long time, is sort of neither capitalist nor socialist nor anything. They're just like all over the place. Yeah. And so like this interpretation of capitalism is easier to approach if, say, one is from one exists in a space where capitalism is like a really big deal. Yeah. Right. How it permeates like literally every aspect of life. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, where in the same way, at least, it doesn't permeate the life, right, the same way it does in America, that versus like my home country. So I've never really thought too much about it. And usually even American capitalism is like very different from like the kind that I experience in my home. So if these interrogations or these subversions will take on different forms, again, depending on what lens you're looking at it through. And then the other thing is, usually when one of the things I find interesting is when people subvert a lot of things, and when they say, oh, so there's this other way or there's this other interpretation of this thing, sometimes that thing exists somewhere else, just out of our usual spaces that we occupy. And it might seem like so far out, but you could pick up like the weirdest news, hear like the weirdest things. There are some villages in Nigeria that where like money, physical money, paper money doesn't carry the same weight as say barter of like goods, right, and services. And when we think about say a future where like, oh, in the post-apocalypse, money doesn't really work, so we might resort to bartering stuff and like exchanging goods, but like that exists now, right?
Yeah.
So like again, so what I'm trying to say is maybe even some of these like alternative systems of economics aren't even alternative; they're just alternative from ours.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So I feel like context is like, for me, science fiction and fantasy, one of the things that I feel is the biggest determinant of like all of these things is the context has to be like really, really clear. Like, this is where I'm approaching this from, so we can like understand why it's going in the direction that it's going, and at least like appreciate that, rather than maybe, you know, just be like, hey, this is the way the whole of the world is. No, it isn't.
Right.
Yeah, I think assumptions and expectations and our personal experiences, we're sometimes so blinded by them that we forget to interrogate them in our work. And I think that, again, just, you know, to kind of harp on how brilliant David Mogo is, David Mogo, Godhunter, check it out in July, is that it really does interrogate and examine you, Suyi, your experiences, your understanding of the world. And it includes enough conversation with the outside world, I suppose, of, you know, the real world, the not on the page world, that you're really able to understand not just where David Mogo's coming from, but where you, Suyi, are coming from. And I think it's really fascinating and beautiful and honest in a way that maybe some other post-apocalyptic works haven't been. And I mean, we're not really interested in dissing on any text specifically in our conversation, but there are some pitfalls to steer clear of in writing the post-apocalypse. And I was wondering if you could think of any more, anything else that you see showing up in the post-apocalypse, in the socioeconomics of the post-apocalypse, that maybe we either aren't interrogating enough, or maybe we're too focused on that we're blinded to something else.
A good example is the piece I wrote recently. I read recently, not wrote. I wish I'd written it. About what the definition of like the apocalypse itself is. And I can't remember where I saw this. I'm going to probably look it up maybe so we can put in like the show notes or something.
Yeah, but, absolutely.
Yeah, it was about how what is usually termed, because like what's the difference? I think the question really was like, what's the difference between a disaster film and an apocalyptic film, right? The disaster film usually is when it's not that big of a deal. So one of the things that was pointed out is like, oh, sure, when this happens in like somewhere else, it's just a disaster movie. But when it happens in the US, it's an apocalyptic.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And then you have the hero who's always this dad this white dad trying to rescue their family, and they do all this manly stuff, etc. It was a very robust critique. Yeah. But I thought about that, right? I thought about how like because one of the things I raised at the talk was like, even as we came to that place and we just started talking about like apocalyptic literature and like post-apocalyptic, I was like, no one has asked what that word even means. What is that word? So I think for me, that might even be the one thing. Like, what is a post-apocalypse? What is an apocalypse even, right?
Yeah.
Because just as I keep saying, like when people say, oh, it has post-apocalyptic vibes, I'm like, well, maybe to you. Right. I mean, to me, it's fun. It's not like it's everyday life, but it's not kind of like much too different. You know, I can literally foresee that happening even without gods, like literally landing in the city. It's still likely to happen in the same way it did, right? So that's kind of what I'm saying. The interrogation of what can be termed, you know, world altering in that sense, in all the forms, both physically, economically, socially. What is this world altering thing, and who gets to define that, and how can we like portray these responses to these events, without actually just thinking about it being one thing, right? All of this, these varied responses, I feel like they should be like captured as much as possible. Yeah, for me, that's pretty much it. I feel like that pretty much covers it. I feel like any other thing I might pinpoint might just like circle back to that point.
Yeah, that seems like the best takeaway.
Is there anything that you are reading or encountering in science fiction or fantasy or science fantasy that has really captured your interest right now? Like, what are you obsessed with right now?
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, this is a pertinent question. For me, because I just moved to like the US, I've been here like less than a year, and so I've been like having to have all these discussions about race, this education about race, and all of this history is different from the history I have on race, right? Coming from like a post-colonial nation, predominantly Black, we interact with race in a different way. And so this adjustment, in that way is something that I've had to be like dealing with. And not only has that like raised questions for me about how that is represented in fiction, right? Like different ways of being something, like being Black and African, for instance, in different spaces. I think so one of the books that I've been reading is a collection of short stories called Friday Black. It's by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. He's I think Ghanaian American. And it pretty much interrogates race, but from a very nuanced perspective, especially being like an immigrant, from like an Black immigrant perspective, which is slightly different from the African American perspective or the complete Africanist immigrant perspective. Yeah, so that has got me thinking, and not just being Black and African, but like about all other forms of this ways of being in a world where you can only be sort of one thing or the other. So that book is getting me to do that. Another book I read recently, which isn't quite, it's more within the mainstream fiction realm, and I read it for class. It's called Your Fates in Mind by Jess Rao. That really talks about the space of transition and transcendence across all these lines, gender lines, racial lines, so it kind of interrogates everything from like discourse about big social issues that have like made their way into pop culture, like Caitlyn Jenner, Rachel Dolezal, etc. So it was a very good critique, and a lot. It has some like speculative elements about like technology that allows it, that makes it easier to move across the spectrum of race, gender, and other forms of identity. So yeah, those things in general have been on my mind so far. And because of course being like Black and African in America, everyone always wants to ask me if I'm like writing about race, if race is a big part of what I'm writing about, and so all of these things are like getting me in that headspace to think about how to like engage with that in both discourse and in my work as well, but also like throwing in my kind of like different perspective from the usual. But yeah, so pretty much that. But aside from that, I'm just like watching shows to like cleanse my palate, like into the back. I love that show. So yeah.
Well, brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I have added them both to my Goodreads to read list, so hopefully I can track those down.
Yes. And we will put them in our notes when we post these episodes, so you can actually look them both up as well. Our listeners.
Yes, absolutely. So, Tony, I believe that brings us to the end of our podcast. Many thanks to Suyi for joining us today.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So, Tony, do you want to go ahead and tell our listeners where they can find out more about our podcast and where they can find out more about Suyi's upcoming book?
Absolutely. So for us, if you want to know more about the podcast, you should definitely just go, like, back around to the dumpster and, like, find the goblins that are out by the dumpster. No, so if you go to our website, that is www.imaginaries.net. If you have not been there in the past week or two, we actually just did a huge facelift, so the website now looks completely different, although all of the content, well, most of the content is still the same, but we have great new introduction pages if you are a new listener to the podcast, as well as some recommendations for reading, for watching, for however you consume your media. You can always listen to us wherever you download your podcasts. If that's iTunes, awesome. If that's SoundCloud, awesome. If it's some app on your phone, whatever you use to listen to podcasts, we're probably there. We're the Imaginaries everywhere. And then our back episodes are up on YouTube. And if you want to talk to us, we are on Twitter at imaginary_pod, and our email address is imaginarypod, no underscore, at gmail.com. If you want to check Suyi out, his website is Suyi Davies, SUYIDAVIES.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at I am Suyi Davies, and everywhere else at Suyi Davies.
Yes.
Thank you, Tony, and I guess goodbye.
Bye.
3, 2, 1.